Let's talk about some of the key events that occurred during and after the Gospels. So, we'd spent a whole module looking at the historical setting of the Gospels, starting from the Persian Empire and going forward. And we had ended at the Roman Empire. And if you remember, the Roman Empire, of course, is the dominant world force on the scene during the time of the Gospels. And this map kind of shows a little bit of the expanse of everything that the Roman Empire included. But this is another one that also shows some of the names and a lot of the places that encapsulated the Roman Empire, because they were absolutely the dominant force. And Mark Strauss says this. He said, when Augustus became emperor in 31 BC, the Roman Empire entered a period of relative peace known as the Pax Romana, which of course means Roman peace. Never before had the whole Mediterranean region had the kind of political stability that Rome brought. The Mediterranean Sea became a Roman lake. The stability brought by Roman occupation allowed relative freedom of travel and a large degree of order throughout the empire, a situation ideal for the spread of Christianity. These roads would prove invaluable for traveling Christian missionaries. The Roman system of law and order also gave Christians a measure of protection as they went from town to town preaching the gospel. Of course, peace is a relative term, and the Romans enforced this Pax Romana through the ruthless suppression of revolt. So it's important to understand the dominance of Rome, but we want to look at is some of the key Roman emperors in the New Testament as well. We looked at the Herod family, the Herodian dynasty in the previous video, but we also need to understand who was really in charge of the whole Roman Empire during this time as well. It's important. And we had already talked about Caesar Augustus, right? This was Octavian who defeated Mark Antony, became Caesar Augustus, and kind of inaugurated the Roman Empire. That was 30 BC to AD 14, and he was the one who was the Caesar at Jesus' birth, mentioned in Luke 2:1. He's also the one who instituted this Pax Romana that we had just referenced. But following him was Tiberius Caesar. Now, this was the Caesar from 14 AD to 37. This is the Caesar of Jesus' public ministry. So when Jesus says in Mark 12:17, render to Caesar what is Caesar's and render to God what is God's, he is referring to this Caesar, Tiberius Caesar. Following him was someone named Caligula, AD 37 to 41. He was the one who demanded his image be placed in the Jerusalem temple, and he was ultimately stopped by Herod Agrippa I. He was followed by Claudius in AD 41 to 54. Now, he was the one, Claudius, who expelled the Jews from Rome in AD 49. And we actually hear about this in Acts 18:2, where Priscilla and Aquila, companions of Paul, they come down to Corinth due to this event. And it says this in Acts 18:1 and 2. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded that all the Jews leave Rome, and he went to see them. So we even hear about this Claudius mentioned in the book of Acts. He's the one on the throne of the Roman Empire there. And as we go down, of course, we've all heard of Nero, one of the most anti-Christian Roman emperors there were from 54 to 68. Paul actually appeals to Nero in Acts 25 and 28. But Nero is, of course, most well known for his violent persecution of Christians. And of course, Paul and Peter both died under Nero's persecution. So Nero was the emperor from 54 to 68. And now he's followed up by Vespasian from 69 to 79. And so Vespasian is important for where we're going next, because he was the one who was declared emperor while responding to the Jewish revolt of AD 66 through 73, which we'll talk about in a moment. But he actually returns to Rome and leaves his son Titus to complete the destruction of the Jerusalem and the temple. And then lastly, he's followed up by the Emperor Domitian, AD 81 to 96. Again, he was one who heavily persecuted the church, and this persecution is most likely the background of the book of Revelation. So as we talk about the Roman Empire, there's a couple important things to know, because we're about to look at the Jewish revolt. But I liked this quote from Mark Strauss. It really gives us a sense of what was happening that really spurred it on and made it happen. So it says that the cost of maintaining the vast Roman Empire was enormous, and Rome imposed a variety of taxes on its citizens, from direct poll and land taxes to indirect tolls or customs on goods in transit. During the time of Jesus, direct taxes were collected by officials of the emperor, but the right to collect indirect taxes was generally leased to the highest bidder. These were often members of the Roman equestrian or upper class who would then use publicans or tax farmers to oversee the collection. This system was open to great abuse and corruption, for Rome did not generally control the surcharges imposed by their agents. The weight of this taxation could be devastating to a poor craftsman or farmer in Israel. Tax collectors were despised not only because of their reputation for extortion, but also because they worked for the hated Romans. Now, these were Jewish tax collectors who worked for the hated Romans he's referring to. Traditional conflicts between Hellenizers and conservatives, which you've already talked about, widespread corruption of and oppression by wealthy aristocrats and landowners, severe Roman taxation, heavy-handed Roman suppression of opposition, at times incompetent and insensitive Roman administration, these factors together with the history of successful revolt under the Maccabees set the stage for the Jewish revolt of AD 66 through 73. So this quote was helpful because it really gives a sense of a lot of the things that Jews were having to deal with under the power of the Roman Empire on a day-to-day basis. Now, if we look here, we had looked at this timeline previously. Now, we know that the period of Jewish independence, also known as the Hasmonean dynasty, preceded the Roman Empire, and there was a significant amount of freedom that was earned. Where this is where the priesthood that started with Mattathias and all of his sons were the dominant leaders on the scene, and then of course the Roman Empire came in and took control. Now, if we slide down the timeline here, we realize that the time of the New Testament, if we look at the birth of Christ, which is roughly about 4 BC, until right around the time where James is killed and the New Testament ends. This is after, of course, Paul is killed. This is during the time of Nero. It's only about 70 years, plus or minus, depending on kind of where you start and look at it. Everything that we read in the New Testament takes place within this pretty short time period, but there's a couple events that happen afterwards that we've already mentioned that we want to make sure that we understand. And of course, they are these two down here. This is where the Jewish War or the Jewish Revolt in 66 through 73. But then there's another one called the Bar Kokhba Revolt that we want to just know about as well. But first, we want to talk about the more important of the two, the Jewish Revolt from AD 66 through 73. What happened here? So this is where the Jews rebelled after all this buildup, right? All the things that were so difficult on Jews. Finally, they've had enough and they rebelled against Rome. And so this was during the time of Nero. He sends Vespasian, who was not emperor at the time, down to Judea to handle the rebellion. Vespasian starts to conquer cities in Galilee and Judea, but Jerusalem actually got delayed because Nero commits suicide in AD 68, and all of a sudden a power struggle emerges between his generals as to who is going to now be the new emperor of the Roman Empire. Vespasian himself actually becomes this new emperor, and he leaves Judea and goes back to Rome, and he places his son Titus in charge of finishing what he had started, and by squelching the Jewish revolt. And this is the background, of course, where in AD 70, Jerusalem was taken and the temple, Herod's temple, the shining glory of the center of Jerusalem, was utterly destroyed. Not to mention the fact that for 3 years, Jerusalem was just a barren wasteland of war, famine, and death. And there, of course, many know that there was a final holdout of Jews at this place called Masada. We don't have time to get into that, but it is in the Four Portraits book. And it's an important piece of Jewish history. But as we study the background, the religious background of the Gospels, we got to understand that with no more temple, there's no more priestly hierarchy. It fades from Jerusalem, and it ultimately fades from Jewish life. And so what happens is that the study of the Torah and the worship in the local synagogues replaces the sacrificial system of the temple. And Judaism shifts heavily into what's known as Rabbinic Judaism, which is kind of the predecessor of today's Orthodox Judaism. So that is kind of a flyover as to what happened as a result of this when the Jewish revolt happened. But then there was this final one where the Jews had another revolt in 135. This, of course, was also crushed by the Romans, and this really wiped Israel off the map as being a political state at all. And it wasn't until 1948 that Israel became a nation again. This is a photo of what's called the Ark of Titus, and this is in Rome, of course. And what this is a celebration monument of Titus's destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So if you get to go to Rome, you will see this ark there. Here's another photo of it. If we look in a little closer, of course, there's the Latin text on there. But if we zoom in, you can actually see some very interesting details on this ark here. So if you notice, you see some very recognizable symbols here. What's happening here is, of course, the menorah, the Jewish lampstand, is being taken out of the temple. So this was a memorial to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Very, very important event for understanding, especially because Jesus himself prophesied that this was going to happen. We read in Luke 21, 5 and 6. It says, "And while some were speaking of the temple, Herod's temple, and how it was adorned with noble stones and offerings, how beautiful it was, Jesus said this, 'As for these days that you see, the days will come when there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down.'" And that is what happened to the temple in the Jewish revolt of AD 66 through 73. So it's really important that we know about that as we understand the background and the political scene of first century Judaism. But what we want to do now is, in our next video, is we want to shift to some core Jewish beliefs. What was it that really defined what it meant to be Jewish? Well, we're going to talk about that in our next video.